Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now at the end of every year it's always nice to look back. However, we're not just looking back at the previous year in today's one, but the previous 11 years. This is the HD 7970, a legendary card from AMD that launched in very late 2011 but became available in very early 2012. I want to use this as a sort of starting point to demonstrate how we're going to benchmark graphics cards in the future. We're going to be testing a lot more games when we do so, and I thought I'd kick things off with this once legendary high-end flagship. This is the HD 7970 versus 20 games, both old and new. If you want to pick one of these up, and you can do so for very cheaply by the way, I paid just £50 for this one, and you intend to play older games, you won't really have any problems. For example, Left 4 Dead 2 is the first game I tested today, and this runs at the highest settings with 1080p resolution and 8x MSAA with almost 250 FPS with solid 1 and 0.1% lows. Portal 2 from 2011 runs at 1080p with the highest settings, again with 8x MSAA, and we're seeing similar frame rates. This is another Valve game and it runs with 261 FPS on average, again with solid percentile figures. CSGO is definitely more CPU intensive and there are no real issues here. There was the occasional little dip which I seem to get with most hardware configurations, but overall the experience was very pleasant with the 7970. Far Cry 3 is perhaps one of my favourite in the series. This dates back to 2012 and it will run absolutely flawlessly with the high preset and 2x MSAA with SSAO and enhanced alpha to coverage. The average frame rate was 88 frames per second and there was nothing within the percentile lows that had me concerned. Fallout 4, I wasn't keen on at first when it came out, but I have to say I find myself playing more and more of it these days. If you have a card like the 7970, it will run with the Ultra preset at 1080p with over 60 frames per second, providing you do uncap the game. Probably not really worth it with this GPU however. Another older title, Battlefield 1, 2016, 1080p with the high preset. We could perhaps go a little bit higher, but of course you are playing competitively online, so the higher the frame rate the better. If that is your entire mentality, then you could of course go with the low settings and the game will still look very good. But I always like to try and find a balance if I can between visual quality and performance. I think the high preset does that perfectly. Skyrim Special Edition from 2016, 1080p with the high preset. I left the 60 FPS cap in place here, not because I didn't try and remove it, but I couldn't seem to. So 60 FPS with a few drops here and there, particularly in those more busier town areas and other areas whereby there's lots of vegetation and dense foliage. GTA 5 dates back to 2015 on PC, would you believe it? I remember the day this came out. I used to play it all the time on my PlayStation 3. 1080p with the high settings, FXAA, no MSAA here, AF times 8, soft shadows, max detail sliders, and all of the advanced graphics off. 89 frames per second is a very solid average indeed, with 74 and 69 respectively in terms of the percentile lows. Now, despite receiving a surprise driver in June of 2022, this was based on an older driver version and didn't really add anything in terms of performance for the card. That said, you can of course use modded drivers which will increase performance in a handful of titles, but I wanted to show you what it could do with the latest official driver today. And with the newer games, I thought we'd start with Red Dead Redemption 2, because this is where you'll start to see this old beast struggle. Red Dead Redemption 2 then 2019 1080p with the high textures, medium TAA and everything else at its respective lowest. I'm used to playing at 30 FPS because I own this game on the PlayStation as well, and I think it's absolutely fine given the slower paced nature of this one, but it is entirely up to you. Dropping to 720p will guarantee you a closer to 60 FPS average, but that's not going to be achievable a lot of the time. God of War 2022 1080p 80% res scale with the low preset here gave us 47 FPS. This was a pretty respectable result as well, and you can certainly get a playable frame rate from most of these titles if you don't mind less than 60 FPS but above 30 if you manage your expectations as far as the settings are concerned. There has been no game so far where there's been sort of a significant amount of stutter. So I'm happy with what I'm experiencing so far, but those newer games are going to really put this thing to work, especially given that it has just 3 gigs of VRAM. Elden Ring we had to drop to 720p with the low preset, and I was able to use high anti-aliasing quality. This one didn't start at first, but I found a handy guide on Reddit that told me that I could replace the D3D12 files and play offline to get this one working. So I suggest googling how to do so if you want to play Elden Ring on a 7970. Other solutions said that it worked by just closing ReaverTuner, so that might be a suitable alternative too. Cyberpunk 2077 also needed to be dropped to 720p with the lowest settings. This ran with 47 FPS on average. Now, along with some of the other games I've tested today, this one does have FSR and we can enable it. It will work fine with the 7970. But it doesn't really make that much of a difference. You can tell it is working because the quality does dip, but it doesn't provide as good of a sort of improvement to the frame rate as it would with newer cards. So I find it easier and more convenient to just drop to a lower native res, and that goes for pretty much all of the other games with FSR today as well. Mafia Definitive Edition from 2020, an absolutely brilliant remake of a classic older title, 1080p with the low preset, 46 FPS. A lot of the time you're going to see between 40 and 50 when playing modern games with the 7970 using the official drivers. Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered is best played at 720p with the very low preset and TAA enabled, but that is of course optional. 48 FPS here, with a 1% low of 31 and a 0.1% low of 24. I did notice one or two little dips in the busier park areas. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt recently received a next gen update, so I've put 2022 as the year of this game, even though it is older. The next gen update has made it more demanding, but we were able to get away with the medium preset with DX11 mode of course, and TAAU enabled. 51 was the average. This is where we saw a problem with the 0.1% low, but this was the result of a dip that occurred when walking through the busy market area. Crysis Remastered did very well, 1080p, medium preset with TAA, and we were able to see over 84 FPS. This ran really nicely on the 7970. I think one of the biggest problems with this card is that it isn't supported any longer officially, and it does of course have just 3 gigs of GDDR5, which is going to limit you as far as certain settings go in some titles, but this one, well, it ran like a dream. Forza Horizon 5 also ran nicely when we set everything to very low and enabled TAA. Again, this is optional, and I did see a little bit of a problem as we made our way towards the busier town area during one of the first races. Now, in more open areas with not a lot going on, it's not uncommon to see a closer to 60 FPS average with increased percentile figures, but if you want to get into those multi-competitor races, you may experience a few issues. Now that was a rather mixed bag of results, but on the most part I think the 7970 still holds up very well. So let's finalise with a few titles that really do allow this thing to show off what it can still do. If you're still playing esports games, then this is going to be absolutely fine. If we start off with Apex Legends here, 2019, 1080p medium textures with TSAA and everything else set to its respective lowest, then we're going to see at least 109 FPS with solid percentile lows as well. Fortnite recently received an Unreal Engine 5 update, but at 1080p with the low preset and 100% resolution scaling with TAA and epic view distance, we are still once again seeing over 100 frames per second. There were a couple of little problems with the percentile lows, but after playing for a while, the game sort of smoothed itself out, so you're not going to experience many issues in this one. Finally, we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, the 2022 release, of course. This was played at 1080p with the minimum preset, which by default will lower the resolution scaling, but I bumped this up to 100% and also set the anti-aliasing quality to high. Here we saw 63 FPS without needing to use FSR or dynamic res scaling. Overall, the HD 7970, a once high-end GPU, can still put up one hell of a fight in 2022. In the 20 games I tested today, I had no problems with starting any of them, even though this isn't a full DX12 card. Elden Ring was the only one that did cause an issue, of course, but this was even resolved by altering a couple of the system files. Even after doing so, the result wasn't brilliant, so you might consider not playing Elden Ring on one of these anyway. But overall, this has been a look back at the 7970. Still a pretty surprising card if you ask me. Thank you very much for watching. Happy New Year to all of you. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.